My name is Corinne Vance, and I was 28 years old the morning my mother showed up to a trust execution she wasn't invited to. My parents had disowned me at 13. I'd refused to give my brother my competitive maritime apprenticeship, and for that they packed my things into a canvas sea bag and told me I didn't belong. I hadn't spoken to them in 15 years. My great uncle Arthur took me in that same week. He raised me, he built me, and when he died in January, he left behind a historic shipping wharf portfolio, a $25 million estate, and a will that named me and only me as everything. What happened in that museum gallery on March 14th, what my father had quietly arranged 2 weeks before, I'm still not sure I have words for, but I'll try. The morning Arthur died, I was sleeping in the caretaker's quarters near the docks. Same coastal property in Penobscot Bay, different building, different lease. I'd moved into mine at 23 and never left. The air tasted of salt and wood smoke that morning. Heavy fog rolled thick across the rugged shoreline, swallowing the jagged granite cliffs. I parked my truck in the gravel lot of the Vance Maritime Museum, the old engine cutting out with a wet metallic cough. Work bag in hand, I checked my breast pocket. The silver drafting compass Arthur gave me on my 14th birthday rested securely against my ribs. The cold metal anchored me. I walked up the weathered cedar steps of the estate house. My boots struck a steady rhythm against the timber. A shadow detached itself from the wraparound porch railing. "You look older, Corinne." Helena Vance stood by the double oak doors, draped in a tailored charcoal trench coat that screamed Boston boutiques rather than coastal Maine. Her hair remained pinned in that rigid, immaculate bun I remembered from my childhood. She smelled faintly of expensive lavender and stale mints. "The meeting is private, Helena," I said. "We are family, Corinne. A tragedy like Arthur's passing requires us to stand together." Her voice carried that practiced, smooth rhythm she used when convincing neighbors to donate to her garden club. "The board invited 47 voting trustees," I said, reaching for the brass door handle. "Your name isn't on the roster." "Your father is parking the sedan." She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch my arm. I stepped back, letting the distance stretch between us. The skin around her eyes tightened, a brief flash of irritation breaking through the carefully constructed veneer of maternal concern. 15 years is a long time to harbor resentment, Corinne. We only want what is fair. "Talk to Clara Vance," I said. "She handles the estate's legal affairs." "We know what you did," Helena whispered, her tone dropping into a sharp hiss. "You locked us out. You kept a dying man prisoner in his own boathouse." I opened the heavy oak door, the brass hinges groaning softly. The warmth of the interior hearth spilled outward, cutting through the damp morning chill. "The meeting starts at 10. I stepped inside and let the door click shut behind me. The heavy timber sealed out the sound of her footsteps on the porch. The main gallery bustled with low murmurs. 47 chairs formed a wide crescent facing a long walnut table. Local preservationists, harbor masters, and commercial tenants milled around the coffee urns. I spotted Clara Vance standing near the windows overlooking the harbor. Her crisp navy blazer and sharp jawline commanded the room. She noticed me, giving a solitary, decisive nod. I walked to the head of the crescent where a single high-backed chair waited. I placed my bag on the table and pulled out a sealed, heavy cardboard folder bound with black twine. Arthur's handwriting dominated the cover, Corinne, for the aftermath. "They're outside," I said, my voice low as Thora approached. "I know," Thora adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the room. "The certified notices arrived at their Portland residence 4 days ago. They took the bait." "Will it hold?" "Arthur spent 3 years fortifying this trust, Corinne. He knew exactly what your father would try the moment his heart failed." Thora tapped the legal ledger on the table. "Every bulkhead, every slipway, every dime of the portfolio is bound to your signature. They can scream at the tide all they want. The ocean doesn't move for them." I sat down, running my fingers over the cold silver compass in my pocket. The room grew crowded as the clock crept toward the hour. I watched the door. Helena entered first, flanked by my father, Thaddeus. His eyes darted greedily across the historic timber framing of the hall. Behind them trailed my brother, Julian, his phone held low against his belt line, the lens aimed squarely at my face. The Tempest had arrived. I opened the folder. To understand how I ended up sitting in that high-backed chair, I have to go back to August of 2011. We lived in Portland, Maine, back then. I was 13 years old. I had just been awarded a competitive summer apprenticeship at the Maine Maritime Academy, a 6-week hands-on program in traditional boat building and navigation. I applied entirely on my own. I wrote the essay at the public library after school because my parents refused to buy printer paper. When the acceptance letter finally came in the mail, I taped it to the refrigerator. 2 days later, my mother sat me down at the dining table. Julian was 16. He needed a prestigious title for his upcoming college applications. My mother adjusted her gold bracelets, her voice dropping into that smooth, comforting tone she used when she wanted to manipulate a situation. "You're already naturally talented at drafting, honey," she said. "Julian needs this on his transcript. He needs the boost." "No," I said. My father slammed his hand flat on the table. The force rattled the silverware against the ceramic plates. My mother's eyes went wet right on cue. I had seen her do that before at parent-teacher conferences whenever she wanted a late assignment waived. "If you cannot put family first," she whispered, "then you do not belong under this roof." I looked at my father. He stared straight ahead, tight-lipped and silent. Julian didn't even look up from his phone. His thumb just kept scrolling through his screen. I walked down the hall to my bedroom, pulled my canvas sea bag from the closet and packed 2 changes of clothes, my library card, and the acceptance letter I ripped off the fridge. I slept on my friend Clara's couch that night with the canvas bag stuffed under my head. The next morning, Clara's mother made me a plate of toast. She asked if she should call someone. Before I could answer, the landline rang. It was Arthur. He was my father's older brother, a retired harbor master who ran the Vance Wharf Trust up in Penobscot Bay. I had only met him a handful of times at holiday dinners, but for 2 years we had been exchanging letters about historical shipbuilding. He was the only adult in the family who ever asked me what I was drawing. "Corrine," Arthur said over the static-heavy line, "pack what you have. I'm already past Brunswick." He drove up in an old black diesel truck, his window rolled halfway down, no sunglasses. He parked directly in front of Clara's house and waited without tapping the horn. I walked down the gravel driveway with my sea bag. He looked at the small bag, then looked at me. That's everything." He didn't offer a hug. He didn't deliver a grand speech about family drama. He simply reached across the bench seat, pushed the passenger door open, and shifted the truck into gear. "We're heading up the coast," he said. "You can go back whenever you want, anytime, but tonight you're sleeping in a proper bed." We spent 3 hours on Route 1 in near total silence. Arthur played an old jazz station on the radio and never asked me what happened at the dinner table. He didn't badmouth my parents, and he didn't give me hollow promises that everything would be fine. Somewhere near Camden, he pulled into a roadside diner and bought me a grilled cheese sandwich and a tall glass of milk. I ate every bite without saying a word. Once we were back on the road, he looked out at the water and said one thing I never forgot. "I don't have children, Corrine, never wanted the noise, but I have a warm guest room and a spare key, and I'd much rather you stay there than crash on somebody's couch." I nodded. That was the entire conversation. That night I stood in his guest room overlooking the bay, the very room that would become my home for the next decade. On clear days you could see the peak of Mount Meganticook rising above the tree line. That night the ridge was buried in storm clouds, but I knew it was out there. Arthur came to the doorway, leaning his heavy frame against the cedar wood. "I've been expecting something like this," he said quietly. "I've seen how they treat you during the holidays. I just didn't know when." He closed the door, and that was the last time anyone in my family made me feel like I didn't have a place to sleep. 15 years on the coast taught me the most important lesson. The sea never forgives hesitation, and people forgive it even less. Arthur drew the lines early on. That same year, he enrolled me in a maritime academy with a strict disciplinary code. Nobody there cared who your parents were, as long as you could plot a course by the stars and stood steady against a gale. He paid the bills in silence, never throwing a single dime in my face. His commandment was simple: your earnings are your decisions, mine remains mine. For my 14th birthday, he handed me a silver drafting compass. It was heavy, with worn steel points that he had once used to lay out the trust's very first piers. "For real targets," he muttered shortly back then. That tool became my anchor, kept inside my jacket pocket every day. After the academy, I finished my finance degree at the University of Maine. Arthur did not attend the graduation. He said those ceremonies were invented for proud mothers, and he had raised a colleague, not a doll. However, on Monday morning, a thick folder and a brief note lay on my office desk at the trust. "Good, now bring this into proper order." And I did. I learned every single square meter of our shoreline. Arthur made me study commercial waterfront leases before I even had the legal right to sign my name. "Papers show who holds the rudder," he liked to repeat, tapping his thick finger against the rent escalation clauses. "Look straight into the core." 3 months before his death, Arthur called me into his office and signed the order appointing me chief financial officer. He used my silver compass to verify the scale on the new harbor blueprints, then locked the papers away in the safe. Thora has an envelope, he said, staring out the window at the whitecaps breaking on the bay. You open it later. What is inside? I asked. He simply shook his head. Later. Arthur taught me two things: how to spot hidden numbers in a balance sheet and how to keep my mouth shut when an opponent is waiting for you to slip up. The first warning sign flashed a year ago. He collapsed right on the wooden deck of the third pier. The paramedics brought him around, and within 2 days he was back in his leather chair proofreading contracts. But the old Arthur was gone. His skin took on a gray, papery tint, and his movements became heavy and angular. He began leaving the office before sunset, an act that would have seemed completely wild to him before. As winter approached, his heart began to fail completely. I moved into the small caretaker's quarters by the slip so I could check his pulse every few hours, just as the cardiologist ordered. During his final week, he left me a scrap of paper with jagged lines of text. Thora holds the perimeter. Listen only to her, and do not let your father anywhere near the harbor. At 6 o'clock that cold January morning, I walked upstairs to check on him. The bedside lamp was still glowing. A historical biography about early navigators rested open on his chest, and his eyes were fixed on the ceiling. He had gone quietly without a struggle. His heart had simply grown too tired to keep beating. He had built a massive empire, the Vance Wharf Trust, starting from a single half-submerged barge and an old boat shed. He had no wife or biological children. He had simply taken in a girl whose own parents had thrown her out, and he gave her a profession, a name, and a future. The funeral was completely private, limited to 30 of his closest captains and business partners. Arthur had written the entire script for the service himself. My parents were definitely not invited. But Helena and Julian showed up anyway. They walked in right in the middle of the service, their heavy black silk rustling loudly. My mother immediately began wiping away non-existent tears and hugging random dockworkers near the entrance. She possessed a rare talent. She could walk into any room and turn someone else's tragedy into her own stage play within 90 seconds. At the memorial lunch, she acted like the hostess of the evening. She hugged the caterers and pressed the hands of the veteran property managers. He was such a bright soul, she whispered to the chairman of the Port Authority, my dearest cousin. In reality, she had only seen him in old photographs over the last decade. Behind her, Julian held his phone at waist level, filming clips for his social media profiles under a loud title, saying goodbye to a maritime legend. He was in his 30s and had his own family, but he still lived entirely for the validation of a virtual crowd. My father was not with them. Mother excused his absence by claiming he had urgent business in the city, but I heard from a local maritime broker that Thaddeus had stayed behind in Portland. He never showed up unless he smelled cash, and nobody had given them the exact figures of the inheritance yet. 3 days after the funeral, the winter sky cleared into a sharp, blinding blue. I took the stairs to the top floor of the harbor plaza where Thora Vance maintained her legal practice. Her office sat right over the water, the large windows framing the cold expanse of the bay. Thora sat behind a massive desk carved from reclaimed ship timber. 3 thick ledgers rested before her, perfectly aligned. Your great-uncle was the most deliberate client I ever represented, Thora said, bypassing any polite small talk. She took off her reading glasses, her gaze steady. He spent years ensuring this transition would function like a watertight bulkhead. She gestured for me to sit and laid out the blueprint Arthur had designed. The official reading of the trust parameters would not be a quiet, closed-door meeting. Arthur had structured the event as a mandatory public assembly combined with a formal confirmation of the trust's chief executive. 47 people have been officially summoned, Thora explained, tapping the top ledger. The entire board of trustees, the Port Authority representatives, our primary commercial tenants, and the directors of 3 regional maritime charity funds. I leaned forward. Why so many people? He wanted an audience, Corrine. He explicitly told me that Thaddeus would try to stir up a storm the second he was gone. Arthur wanted 47 credible witnesses to see exactly how the doors lock. Thora then reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a heavy iron lockbox, placing it on the wood between us. A small note in Arthur's blocky handwriting was taped to the top lid, Corrine, for the aftermath. He gave strict orders, Thora said, sliding a small iron key across the desk. You take this home. You open it in private, completely alone, not before the day of the assembly. I picked up the box. It was surprisingly heavy, the dark metal cold against my palms. Arthur knew your father's patterns, Thora added quietly. He anticipated the greed. I didn't ask further questions. Arthur had always told me that patience wins more battles than curiosity. I put the lockbox into my canvas bag and drove back to the caretaker's quarters. I set it on my kitchen table and left it untouched. The digital warning shots fired 3 days later. I was at my desk analyzing the quarterly maintenance costs for the fifth pier when my phone vibrated. An unknown number had sent a long, blocky text message. "Kareen, blood is blood. I know things have been cold between us, but your father is falling apart with grief. We need to handle Arthur's estate as a family before this escalates. Call me." I stared at the screen, recognizing the rhythm of my mother's writing. I locked the phone and placed it face down on the desk. 20 minutes later, the screen lit up again. "It's only right that we settle this like adults. Don't turn your back on your own flesh and blood." The next morning, a voicemail notification popped up. I played it. Helena's voice sounded perfectly smooth, adopting that gentle maternal tone she typically used when demanding a refund at a boutique counter. "Kareen, sweetie, stop ignoring us. We need to sit down and sort out the harbor portfolio together. Your father has rights as Arthur's brother." An hour later, a direct message appeared on my professional portal from Julian. "If you humiliate Mom and Dad at that public assembly, you're going to regret it. Everyone in this town will know how you isolated an old, sick man." I didn't reply to a single character. Instead, I took screenshots of every message, recorded the timestamps of the calls, and forwarded the data directly to Thora's legal assistant with a short note for the master file. Thora's reply came back within 5 minutes. "Perfect. Keep documenting everything. Let the net tighten." Julian's digital campaign escalated over the next 4 days. He shifted his tactics, moving from direct threats to a public smear campaign. 14 notifications flooded my professional and personal accounts. The initial messages attempted a soft approach filled with false nostalgia. "Hey, little sis, can we just talk? I actually miss the old days before the rift." I knew the script. I had watched Julian perform manufactured warmth for an audience since he was 10 years old. When the silence from my end persisted, his tone darkened by the second day. "Mom is crying herself to sleep every single night because of your coldness. She is completely devastated by how you're acting." By day 3, he dragged our childhood into the mud. "Kareen, our parents are getting older now. They have put the past behind them, but you are choosing to be cruel and spiteful." Then came the final message on day 4, stripped of any remaining pretense. "If you try to lock us out of that public assembly, you will face the consequences." I left every single message unread and unanswered. I simply logged the data into the archive file for Thora. That afternoon, Julian took the battle offline. I was working on the lower deck of the main wharf building when the receptionist called down, her voice tight with panic. My brother had walked right past the front desk, claiming he was the family representative for the trust. Security intercepted him near the administrative offices. From the second-story window, I watched the confrontation play out on the gravel lot below. Julian argued with our veteran guard for 6 minutes, his face twisting into an ugly, flushed mask before he finally turned on his heel and stormed back to his car. Within an hour, he launched a targeted post on his social media network. The image was a solid black tile with stark white text. "Some people forget the family that built them. Greed cuts deeper than the winter tide." The post quickly racked up hundreds of reactions and dozens of supportive comments from online acquaintances who had absolutely no context. A few of my junior dock workers saw the post on their feeds. They didn't say a word to me about it, and I deeply appreciated their silence. That night, I opened Julian's public profile for the first time in years and scrolled through his history. It became immediately clear that he had been building this specific narrative for months, long before Arthur's heart failed. There were carefully staged family group photos where my absence was treated like an open wound, accompanied by heavy-handed captions about forgiveness, bloodlines, and the importance of elder care. He had transformed our long-standing estrangement into regular content, painting himself as the tragic peacemaker of a war he had enthusiastically supported when we were teenagers. I locked my device and placed it in my bag. The digital noise didn't change the physical reality of the harbor. The following week, I officially moved into Arthur's old office at the top of the main slipway. Technically, the space belonged to me now, but I left his belongings exactly where they had always rested. His heavy leather armchair still bore the indentation of his frame. His weather-beaten maritime charts lay unrolled on the side table next to a tarnished brass mug with the words "The Harbor Master's Word is Law" engraved on the side, a joke I had saved up to buy him 4 winters ago. I opened the master portfolio ledger to review the core assets. The trust comprised 12 distinct commercial maritime properties. 3 were deepwater piers in the outer harbor, including a massive storage warehouse and a light industrial fishpacking facility. 4 properties occupied the busy central boardwalk, operating as high-traffic retail spaces with incredibly stable, long-term commercial tenants. 2 properties rested on the northern ridge, including the museum building and the main administrative office. The final 3 assets were located in the historic Lower District, older, timber-framed boathouses that required meticulous preservation, the exact kind of historical architecture Arthur loved most. The total appraised value of the physical holdings sat at $25 million, generating a steady net operating income of nearly $2 million annually. Arthur had built this entire layout from that single, ruined boat shed he purchased in the late 80s for a fraction of its current worth. It represented 42 years of highly disciplined, patient execution. I remembered sitting in his leather chair when I was 19, watching him analyze a commercial tenant dispute. The contract always dictates who holds the upper hand, he had told me, running a rough thumb along the dispute resolution clause. Never let your emotions read the fine print for you. The person who stays calm and reads the technical language always wins the harbor. I knew every line of those 12 property leases by heart. Arthur had made sure of it. That was the reason he had handed me the CFO position. As I closed the master ledger, my eye caught a small object slipped behind the desk organizer. It was Arthur's personal pocket logbook, a small leather notebook he carried everywhere. I opened it to the very last entry, dated 3 days before his passing. The text was written in his signature blocky cursive, though the ink lines were slightly uneven. Clara has the iron lockbox for Corinne. She needs to review the contents before the public assembly opens. I reached down and pulled the heavy iron box out of my canvas bag, setting it squarely under the desk lamp. I had carried it around for a week without unlocking it. Tonight was the night. 2 days later, I pushed open the heavy glass exit doors of the Harbor Plaza after a long strategy session with Clara. I chose the concrete stairwell, just as I always did, preferring the steady movement to the enclosed elevator. As I stepped out into the damp chill of the ground floor breezeway, a harsh, familiar voice echoed off the concrete walls. "Listen to me, Delaney, we just need to file the initial injunction immediately." The man was completely incapacitated during his final 6 months. Everyone on the docks saw it. We have to establish our claim before she locks down the signature authority. I froze, pressing my back against the rough cedar siding near a row of decorative harbor planters. I held my breath. My father, Thaddeus, stood near the entry brickwork, his old flannel jacket looking out of place against the polished glass of the plaza. He held his phone tightly against his ear, his jaw clenched so hard the tendons in his neck stood out. A brief, muffled response sputtered from the phone speaker. "I don't care about the retainer fee," Thaddeus snapped, lowering his head but failing to lower his volume. He had no direct heirs. The portfolio belongs back with the family line. That's how the Maritime Trust structure works. Just have the paperwork ready for the 14th. That's the formal confirmation date. He ended the call, adjusted the collar of his jacket, and marched toward the gravel parking lot without looking back. I waited a full minute until the sound of his engine faded onto Route 1. I pulled out my phone and called Clara directly. "Thaddeus just left the plaza grounds," I said, my voice cutting through the wind. "He's working with an attorney named Delaney. They are planning to file an incapacity injunction to halt the executive confirmation on the 14th. Clara paused for 2 beats. "Thank you for the warning. I'll pull the registration files for Delaney's office immediately. Stay the course, Corinne. Arthur built a fortress around this trust for this exact reason." I hung up, walked down to the pier, and sat in my truck. The gray winter sky was turning to dusk. I pulled the heavy iron lockbox out of my work bag and placed it on the passenger seat. The small iron key slid into the keyhole with a clean, heavy click. Inside the box lay 2 distinct items. On top rested a handwritten letter from Arthur spanning 3 pages of thick drafting paper. The ink was dark and steady, dated nearly a year prior. "Corinne, I kept these out of your sight because I didn't want your childhood overshadowed by a debt," the letter began. "You came to my gate at 13 with nothing but a canvas bag and a library card, and you earned your place every day after that. That was all the family I ever required. Your father has been writing to me since the week you arrived. 11 letters across 15 years. Every single one is a demand for cash. Some of them offer you as leverage." My chest tightened. I lifted the letter and looked at the second item in the box, a thick stack of standard business envelopes secured by a weathered rubber band. The return addresses were all stamped from Portland, my father's handwriting. I opened the first envelope. The text inside was blunt, detailing a mortgage shortfall and casually mentioning that Sandra and Julian might let Corrine come home for a visit if Arthur could see his way toward expanding Thaddeus's credit line. I went back to Arthur's letter, skimming to the final paragraph. Your father cast you out when he thought you were a liability, then tried to trade you back the moment he realized I had money. I never bartered. That is the difference between blood and family, Corrine. You were never the backup choice. You were the one who stayed. I closed the iron box, turned the ignition, and drove back to the slips through the gathering dark. I knew exactly how the 14th would play out. I sat at the heavy walnut desk in the administrative office at sunrise the next morning, the iron lockbox resting open beside my coffee cup. Thora walked in without knocking, carrying a fresh legal pad and a thermal flask. She didn't offer any morning pleasantries. She simply pointed at the chronological stack of letters I had pulled from the box. "Let me see them," she said. I handed her the first 3 envelopes from 2011. Thora read through them with the cold, precise focus of a marine surveyor checking a hull for rot. Her eyes narrowed as she reached the 3rd page of my father's writing, where he explicitly suggested a financial trade-off regarding my apprenticeship status. "This is exactly the pattern Arthur warned me about," Thora murmured, setting the pages down in a neat row. Thaddeus wasn't grieving a broken relationship. He was tracking an investment portfolio. "I want them in the room for the confirmation, Thora," I said. My voice sounded flat, stripped of any anger. "Every single one of them." Thora paused, her glasses slipping slightly down her nose. "The bylaws don't require their presence to finalize your executive status. We can legally bar them from the gallery." "No," I countered, looking out at the gray water slapping against the pilings of the second pier. "If they are going to attempt to halt the proceedings with an incapacity claim, they will do it in front of the entire community. I want 47 witnesses to hear exactly what Arthur wrote before they try to open their mouths." Thora studied my expression for a few silent seconds. Then she pulled her pen from her blazer pocket and began scratching notes onto her pad. "I'll issue formal, certified gallery passes to their hotel in the morning. They'll think it's a concession. They'll view it as an open door to mount their ambush." "Good. Have you verified Delaney's background yet?" "Frank Delaney," Thora said, her pen tapping a rhythmic beat against the legal pad. "Small estate practice out of Tacoma. He hasn't filed a single formal motion with the county court yet, just an initial intake conflict check. He's out of his depth, Corrine. He thinks he's handling a standard small business dispute, not a protected maritime trust." She gathered the letters, stacked them perfectly back into the iron box, and slid the key across the wood to me. "Keep this secure. If they stay silent during the reading, we file these away permanently and let Arthur's private thoughts stay private, but if they cause a scene, we use the ledger." I nodded, sliding the cold iron key back into my pocket alongside Arthur's silver drafting compass. The metal felt heavy against my ribs, a solid counterweight to the storm brewing down the coast. The certified invitations were hand-delivered by a courier the following afternoon. The response was immediate. By 6 o'clock that evening, a new voicemail from Helena clogged my line. Her voice held a sharp, dangerous edge that she tried desperately to mask with her usual society page warmth. "Corrine, we received the gallery passes. We know exactly what kind of game you and Thora are playing with Arthur's assets. Your father has already retained legal representation, and we are fully prepared to challenge the validity of that document in open court if you force our hand. Do the sensible thing before you embarrass yourself in front of the entire harbor." I didn't replay the message. I simply exported the audio file into the legal archive and closed my laptop. The tide was rising and the parameters were set. 1 week before the scheduled assembly, Thora walked me through the legal landscape inside her closed office. She bolted the door, poured 2 glasses of ice water, and laid the regional maps flat across the timber desk. The foundational will had already been certified and recorded with the Knox County Superior Court. "Arthur took an extra precaution," Thora explained, her finger resting on a medical authorization stamp. "He had the regional chief of medicine conduct a comprehensive cognitive evaluation on video exactly 6 days before he signed the final documents. It's a standard safeguard for high-value maritime portfolios, but Arthur insisted on it. He wanted a vault." She flipped the page to reveal the core definitions of my appointment. "You are designated as both the sole heir to the residue and the sole executor of the trust," she said. the law treats those roles distinctly. As heir, the physical assets become yours. As executor, you possess absolute administrative authority. You alone dictate the timeline and distribution of funds. Thora leaned back, tapping the legal pad. Under Maine Maritime Trust law, once the board confirms the executive status, I will petition for non-intervention administration. That means you manage the 12 wharves and the millions in capital without needing a judge to sign off on every single lease renewal or repair cost. It gives you total independence. And the family's challenge? I asked. Delaney filed the initial intake form with the state board 2 days ago, Thora said, her eyes narrowing. They are targeting 3 standard grounds: undue influence, lack of capacity, or fraud, but the factual record is completely clean. The video exam is ironclad, and Arthur's intent is explicitly detailed across 12 years of correspondence with my firm. She paused, looking at the iron box on the side table. Delaney will try to slow the process down. He will lose, but it will cost the trust time and money. Are you prepared for a prolonged siege? I've been preparing for 15 years, I said. The night before the assembly, I walked down to the lower slips at 6 o'clock to secure the equipment lockers before the evening frost set in. As I approached my truck, a shadow stepped out from behind the old bait shack. Julian stood leaning against the driver's side door of my vehicle, his phone held out at chest level. The small blue light on his screen glowed in the twilight. I just want a statement, Karine, he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, dramatic tone he used for his online broadcasts. 5 minutes to clear the air. I stopped 10 feet away, my hands deep in my jacket pockets, my fingers brushing the edges of the silver compass. Turn the lens off, Julian. I'm not recording anything official, he lied, keeping the phone angled toward my face. The indicator light is blue, I said, my voice completely level. Turn it off or leave the property. He lowered the device slightly, his jaw tightening into a hard, defensive line. You're really going to humiliate the family tomorrow in front of the whole town, aren't you? You think you're safe behind Thora's paperwork. I stepped forward, pulled my keys from my pocket, and opened the driver's side door. I'm not the one trying to sell a story to a crowd, Julian. His face flushed red under the dock lamps. As I backed the truck out of the gravel space, I saw him raise the phone again through the rearview mirror, snapping a fast photograph of my license plate. He collected information like currency, storing away random details without even knowing how he would weaponize them later. I drove back to the Este Aerogekea, the heater blasting against the coastal chill. Thora answered my call on the first ring. Everything is locked down, she stated firmly. 47 confirmed attendees, the court stenographer is booked, the documentation is organized, you speak when you are ready, Karine, not 1 second before. The clock inside the museum gallery chimed 9:30 on the morning of March 14th. The space filled up quickly, the 47 seats arranged in a wide crescent around the long central table. Every chair bore a cream-colored placard printed with a name in crisp black type. At the apex of the crescent sat a single high-backed oak chair with no label. That was my place. I sat down, setting the iron lockbox flat on the dark wood next to my files. Thora stood by the wide windows, her gaze tracking the morning tide. The sky had cleared completely over Penobscot Bay, and the cold winter sun lit the whitecaps in the harbor with brilliant, sharp clarity. Near the corner, a court stenographer adjusted her machine. 2 independent auditors from the Regional Maritime Council sat in the back row, already skimming their ledgers. I recognized the harbor master from the neighboring district, along with representatives from the 3 coastal charity foundations Arthur had supported for decades. Commercial tenants arrived in pairs, the family that operated the harbor bookstore, the couple running the fishermen's co-op on the 3rd pier. These were people who had shaken Arthur's hand every quarter for 40 years. At exactly 9:55, the double doors at the back of the gallery swung open. Helena walked in first. She wore a dramatic black dress, though the crisp white price tag still peeked out from beneath the collar at the back of her neck. Whether she had forgotten to remove it or intended to return the garment after the weekend, I couldn't tell. Thaddeus followed 2 paces behind. His suit jacket was noticeably too broad in the shoulders and short at the wrists, a hasty rental, clear as day. His eyes immediately darted across the timber framing of the room, counting heads, looking for the exits. Julian came last, his phone gripped flat against his palm at hip level, the lens tilted toward the room. Helena began working the gallery immediately. She stepped toward a woman she had never met, extending both hands with a look of profound sorrow. I am Karine's mother, her voice carried clearly across the room. It is so comforting to see how much love there is for our family today." The woman, one of our senior property managers, smiled tightly and took a deliberate step back. Helena moved toward the front row. I remained seated, my hands flat on the iron box. I looked at Thora and gave a solitary nod. Thora stepped directly into Helena's path. "Mrs. Vance, welcome. Your assigned seating is in the second row to the right." Helena paused, her expression hardening before she quickly restored her polite smile. "We are the immediate family, Thora. Surely our place is at the main table." "The seating arrangement is established," Thora said, her voice dropping into a level, final register. "Please take your seats." Helena held Thora's gaze for 3 seconds before she turned and glided to the designated row. Thaddeus sat heavily beside her, his boots scuffing the floorboards. Julian took the end seat, his phone still gripped low against his knee. Across the room, Helena rose again, drifting toward the director of the Regional Maritime Fund. "Arthur loved the coast," she whispered, her eyes going wet right on cue. "He always wanted the family to protect it together. Corinne is my youngest, you know. We've had our distance, but blood is blood." The director looked down at Helena's extended hand, gave a short, professional nod and walked toward the coffee urn. On the opposite side of the crescent, Julian tried to corner the harbor master, holding his phone up slightly. The harbor master, a veteran Coast Guard captain with a sharp silver crew cut, stared directly at the device. "Put that away," the captain barked. "This is a legal proceeding, not a broadcast." Julian flinched, dropping the phone into his coat pocket. From my seat I watched Thaddeus. He wasn't trying to speak with anyone. He sat rigid, his knee bouncing rhythmically, his eyes darting toward the gallery doors every 30 seconds. He turned to check the hallway 3 times in 2 minutes. Thora leaned down, her voice a whisper near my ear. "He's checking the clock, he's waiting for his vanguard." I placed my palm against the cold metal of the lockbox. "Let them wait." At exactly 10:00, Thora stepped to the center podium and called the assembly to order. The room fell silent in layers. First the rustle of paper died down, then the murmur near the coffee station vanished, and finally, the rhythmic clicking of the stenographer's keys became the only sound in the hall. "We are here today for the formal execution of the Vance Wharf Trust," Thora began, her voice echoing off the high cedar rafters. "Established by Arthur Elias Vance, this document was finalized and notarized on June 14, 2024, in the presence of 2 independent witnesses." She adjusted her glasses and looked across the assembly, her gaze pausing briefly on my parents before she looked back down at the ledger. "The founder left explicit instructions regarding the structure of this assembly. I quote directly, 'It is my absolute wish that this reading serve as both a public confirmation of fiduciary authority and a boundary against those who spent my life looking for a payout.'" Sandra shifted violently in her seat, the leather creaking under her weight. Thora turned the page, her movements slow and deliberate. Article 1 outlines the core administrative provisions. Article 2 establishes the charitable distributions, 5% of the total asset value to the main children's fund, 5% to the Coast Guard Veterans Trust, and 5% to the Maritime Preservation Foundation. Quiet nods of gratitude rippled through the front row of trustees. Article 3, Thora's voice grew louder, cutting through the murmurs. "I hereby designate my niece, Corinne Marie Vance, as sole heir to the residue of my estate, including all physical wharves, commercial slipways, and business entities operating under the Vance Trust. I further designate Corinne Marie Vance as sole executor, granting full authority for non-intervention administration." 44 heads turned simultaneously to look at me. I kept my hands resting flat on the iron box, my face completely expressionless. "This designation," Thora continued, slowing her pace, "is made with the explicit awareness that my younger brother, Thaddeus Vance, is a surviving sibling. He is intentionally excluded from any and all inheritance. This exclusion is not made in error." The gallery seemed to hold its collective breath. The auditors stopped writing. Thaddeus stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floorboards. "This is absolute fraud. The man was completely out of his mind during his last year. She manipulated him. She's been pulling his strings since she ran away from our house as a child." Sandra stood right up beside him, turning to face the crescent of trustees like an actress addressing an audience. "You people don't know the truth. She isolated him from his true family for 15 long years. She took advantage of a sick old man just to get her hands on these docks." Nobody in the gallery spoke. The harbor master crossed his arms, his face turning to stone. "We are his real family," Sandra cried out, her voice cracking with forced emotion. I raised that girl, I put food on her plate, and this cold, calculated theft is how she repays us. For a fraction of a second, I saw right through the theatrical display. Sandra actually believed her own script. In her mind, 13 years of basic motherhood entitled her to a multi-million-dollar maritime portfolio. Her logic was completely warped, but she had lived inside it for so long she couldn't see the reality of her own choices. I stayed in my chair, I didn't lean back, and I didn't blink. Thora raised her hand, palm flat. Mr. and Mrs. Vance, take your seats immediately. You will have a single opportunity to speak after the recording is finalized. I'm not sitting down until this sham is halted, Thaddeus snarled, stepping into the aisle. My brother was an invalid, he couldn't even walk down to the slips without assistance. Kareen controlled every document put in front of him. That is undue influence, and we have the legal grounds to freeze this entire asset transition. He looked toward the back doors again, his jaw clenching. The vanguard he had been praying for was officially late. Thora let his words echo through the hall. She adjusted her glasses, her voice dropping into the cool, precise register she used for contract violations. The legal standard for a trust challenge requires factual proof, Thaddeus, not personal grievances. The medical evaluation from June 8th was filmed and certified. It remains archived with my firm. Your claims have no basis in the record. Thaddeus glared at her. We have legal counsel. He's entering the building right now. Right on cue, the heavy gallery doors clicked open. A man in his mid-40s stepped inside, gripping a worn leather briefcase. His tie hung slightly askew, and he had the flustered look of someone who expected a small office meeting rather than a formal assembly of 47 trustees. Frank Delaney stopped 2 paces into the room. His eyes swept across the horseshoe of seats, the independent auditors, the court stenographers' moving fingers, and finally my father's pale face. Thora didn't miss a beat. Mr. Delaney, welcome. Please take a seat. We were just reviewing the incapacity arguments. If you wish to examine the certified trust documents on behalf of your clients, a copy is right here. She slid a thick, blue-bound folder across the walnut table. Delaney approached slowly, set his briefcase down, and opened the text. The room watched in complete silence as he read through the first 3 pages. When he reached the section detailing the independent video evaluation, his shoulders slumped. He closed the binder and turned toward Thaddeus. Thaddeus, we need to step outside immediately, Delaney muttered, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. Thaddeus blinked. Just file the motion we talked about. We are stepping outside, Delaney repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sandra cut in, her voice rising. What is the problem? You told us. Mrs. Vance, Delaney cut her off, gesturing to the crowded gallery. I was told this was a private estate reading. This is a formal probate proceeding, and the factual record does not align with your initial brief. I stood up, I didn't rush. I placed both palms flat on the walnut surface, pushed my chair back, and stood exactly the way Arthur used to at the start of a harbor review. The room went completely still. I reached down, flipped the iron latches on the lockbox, and pulled out Arthur's handwritten letter along with the thick stack of envelopes. My uncle left this letter in the lockbox the day he finalized his will, I said, my voice steady and clear. He wrote it to ensure the truth remained part of the record. Thaddeus has been writing to him since the week I arrived on the docks. 11 letters over 15 years, every single one is a demand for money. Sandra opened her mouth to speak, but I looked directly at her. I am not finished, I said. She sank back into her seat, her jaw trembling. My family didn't lose a daughter, I said, looking from Thaddeus to Sandra, then to Julian. They traded her. And then they spent 15 years trying to use her as leverage against the brother they envied, the man who took me in anyway. I am not looking for an apology, nor am I interested in an explanation. Blood was never the issue here, your choices were. I pulled Arthur's silver drafting compass from my pocket, using its weighted end to hold down the edges of the master file. Then, using his favorite ink pen, I signed the executive confirmation paperwork. The pen made a sharp click against the wood when I set it down. If you wish to file a suit, file it, I told them. The trust is secure. Thora will defend the estate, and every dime of our legal costs will be billed directly to your personal accounts. Delaney stood up, picked up his briefcase, and nodded tightly to Thora. My office will formally withdraw as counsel by Monday morning. Good day. He walked out of the gallery, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind him. Sandra wept, but this time nobody in the gallery reached for a tissue. The harbor master looked out the window at the rising tide, his face carved from weathered stone. The charity directors closed their folders with sharp, final snaps. The court stenographer typed the last line, lifted her fingers from the keys, and let the room breathe. Julian's hand drifted toward his coat pocket, his fingers twitching toward his phone, but he stopped. He looked at the 44 witnesses watching his every movement, and he slowly folded his arms over his chest instead. Thaddeus gripped Sandra's elbow, hoisting her out of the chair. Her sobs grew louder, shaking her shoulders as they shuffled down the center aisle, but the performance had completely lost its power. Nobody moved to offer comfort, nobody cleared a path. Julian followed a few paces behind, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. He paused at the heavy oak doors, looking back at me for a single, fleeting second. I saw a flash of raw recognition in his face, the sudden awareness that the narrative had completely broken down. Then the heavy timber doors clicked shut behind them. The remaining trustees sat in their seats, letting the silence settle over the room like dust. The harbor master was the first to rise. He walked to the head of the crescent, extending a thick, calloused hand across the table. "Your uncle was a man of his word, Corinne," he said, his grip firm. "You run these wharves the way he taught you." The room emptied slowly after that. The auditors packed their ledgers into leather cases, the charity representatives offered quiet words of support, and the catering staff cleared away the cold coffee urns. By 11:00, the gallery was empty, save for Thora and me. She poured 2 glasses of water from the thermal flask and sat in the chair across from mine. "Thaddeus will try to find another lawyer," Thora said, setting her glasses on the wood. "Delaney is out, but your father is stubborn. It will take 90 days for the court to formally throw out any secondary petitions they try to scrape together. They will lose, but expect some noise." "Let them try," I said, taking a slow drink of water. My throat felt raw, as if I had been shouting against a gale, though I hadn't raised my voice once. Thora looked at the iron lockbox resting between us. "Arthur told me something during our final meeting about his estate plan, right after we finalized the video exam. I asked him why he was leaving the entire portfolio to a teenager who walked onto his docks 15 years ago. I needed his exact reasoning for the legal file." I waited, my fingers tracing the silver drafting compass in my pocket. "He looked out at the third pier," Thora said softly, "and he told me, 'Thora, I've spent 40 years building 12 wharves, but the sturdiest thing on this waterfront is the girl who showed up with a canvas bag and never once asked me for a single handout.'" I looked past her, out through the floor-to-ceiling glass. The winter sun sat high over Penobscot Bay, lighting the jagged granite cliffs and the deep blue expanse of the outer channel. The ridge of Mount Meganticook stood sharp against the sky, completely clear of clouds. 6 months later, I sat in the heavy leather chair at the top of the main slipway, reviewing the closing documents for a historic deepwater commercial dock in the lower district. It was a $4 million acquisition, my first official expansion as chief executive of the Vance Wharf Trust. Arthur would have approved of the terms. It was an old timber structure with incredibly strong foundational pilings, the exact kind of property that rewarded long-term patience. Thaddeus had filed his secondary contest petition through a cheap city attorney in April. The county judge dismissed the motion within 8 weeks for total lack of evidence and standing. The court ordered Thaddeus to pay $84,000 to cover the trust's legal defense fees, and the state asset garnishment on his Portland auto shop began late that summer. Sandra sent one final letter in September. I recognized the neat, rounded loops of her handwriting on the white envelope the moment the mail clerk dropped it on my desk. I didn't rip the seal. I opened the lower drawer of Arthur's desk, placed the unopened envelope next to his old pocket logbook, and slid the drawer shut. Julian had deleted his public profiles by midsummer, his digital audience dissolving the moment the real-world facts became common knowledge along the coast. I didn't look up the details to verify the rumors. The Vance Wharf Trust now stood at 13 active commercial properties, its total value climbing past $28 million. The docks were busy, the fleet was moving, and the ledger was perfectly balanced. I pulled the silver drafting compass from my pocket and set it squarely on the fresh harbor blueprints. The metal clip had worn smooth on one side from years of friction against my canvas jacket, but the points remained perfectly sharp. Some boundaries are built from timber and stone, and some are built from silence. The people who threw me out when I was 13 years old could never cross this shoreline again. That wasn't a matter of anger, and it wasn't a matter of revenge. It was simply the law of the harbor.
Wow, Corinne stood her ground, kept her receipts, and let the facts do the talking. But it makes you think about how far some people will go when money is involved. So, I have to ask you, what would you have done if you were in Corinne's shoes? Would you have confronted your family sooner, or would you have played the long game and let the law handle it exactly the way she did? How would you deal with a family that only showed up when there was a paycheck involved? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know exactly what you think about how this story turned out. I read every single comment, so let's talk about it. And if you want to see more stories like this, please hit that subscribe button right now. It is incredibly important to me and helps the channel grow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.